It started with a phone call I did not want to answer. I saw the name flash across my screen, Richard, and I thought about letting it ring. We had been divorced for 6 years. 6 long, hard years. But my daughter Carla had reminded me to keep things civil for the sake of our grandson Noah, who was turning 8. So I picked up. "The party should be at your house," Richard said, without a hello. Just his voice, certain and flat, like he still had the right to make decisions about my home. "You have the bigger space. Noah loves your yard." I took a quiet breath. "Richard, I already planned the party here. That was never in question." "Good. Then we'll open all the gifts there too. Easier for everyone." Something tightened in my chest. Not quite anger, but something older and quieter. I had spent 6 years making this house entirely mine again. I had painted the walls the colors I wanted, planted the flower beds Richard always called a waste of time, rebuilt each room into something that belonged to me alone. And now he wanted to walk back in like none of that had happened. "Fine," I said, "you can come. But I have one rule before anyone sits down." "What kind of rule?" he asked. "You'll find out when you get here." I hung up before he could argue. "My name is Vivian Calloway. I am 64 years old, retired after 31 years as a nurse, living alone in the house my ex-husband and I built together back when I believed love was enough to hold 2 people in place. I was wrong about that. But I was right about the house. It was always worth fighting for." The party was Saturday. I had 4 days to prepare. Not just the cake, balloons, and the little sandwiches Noah loved, but something else entirely. Something I had been building quietly for nearly 2 years, waiting for exactly the right moment. That moment had arrived. I did not sleep well after Richard called. I lay in the dark listening to the tree outside my bedroom window scratch the glass, thinking about all the years I had spent not saying things. All the times I had chosen silence because I did not want to be seen as the bitter ex-wife. Because I wanted my children to have peace, even when I had very little of my own. In the morning I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with a folder I had kept in the bottom drawer of my desk for nearly 2 years. Bank records, printed emails, a transcript of a voicemail saved before switching phone providers. I had assembled these things slowly, never certain exactly when I would need them. Only certain I would. When Richard and I divorced, he told the court he had almost nothing. He appeared at proceedings claiming financial hardship, saying that supporting our children and reaching a fair settlement would be a serious burden. I was too exhausted and heartbroken to push back. My attorney was inexperienced and I let things go. But 2 years later, my son-in-law Percy, who works in finance and has a sharp eye for what does not add up, was helping me review old joint tax records for a refinancing application. He set down his coffee slowly. "Vivian," he said, "do you know about an account at Meridian Savings?" I did not. Percy showed me what he had found. A joint savings account opened in the 2nd year of my marriage, with a mailing address I did not recognize. Glenda's house. Richard had been moving money into it for years before our divorce, hiding it from our shared finances and then from the court. At the time of our divorce filing, it held over $94,000. I had received none of it. I had spent that first year cutting coupons and turning the heating down, believing every word he had said about having nothing left. By Saturday, I had been ready for a long time. I woke up early on Noah's birthday and got to work. I blew up the blue and silver balloons he had chosen at the party shop 2 weeks before. I set out the rocket-patterned plates because Noah had been obsessed with space ever since his kindergarten teacher showed the class a launch video. I made sandwiches with the crusts cut off and baked the chocolate cake from my grandmother's handwritten recipe. I was calm. I want you to understand that. Not shaking, not pacing. What I felt that morning was a quiet, steady certainty. I knew what I was going to do. I knew why. And whatever happened next would be the truth, which is the only thing worth standing on. Carla arrived at noon with Percy and Noah, who ran straight into my arms smelling of sunshine and strawberry shampoo. He pulled back and looked at the decorations with wide eyes and grinned in the way that makes any room feel warmer. "Gran, it's perfect," he said. Carla hung back while Percy took Noah to see the cake. My daughter has always had watchful eyes. She got them from me. "Are you okay, Mom?" she asked quietly. Better than okay, I said. She studied me a moment, then nodded. Richard arrived at noon with his new wife Belinda, who wore a sundress and a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Behind them came Glenda in her best cardigan, chin already lifted like she was expecting a fight. They carried wrapped gifts into my living room like they owned the place. Richard looked around at the new paint, the rearranged furniture, the photographs that no longer included him, and something flickered across his face. Looks different, he said. It is different, I told him pleasantly. It's mine now. He gave a short laugh. Then he set the gifts down and said, let's get settled and open presents. I folded my hands and looked at every person in the room. Before anyone sits down, I said clearly, I have one rule. The room went still. Even Noah, running his fingers along the gift table, stopped and looked at me with curious dark eyes. Richard tilted his head. What are you talking about, Vivian? Before anyone sits down in this house today, I said, keeping my voice even and unhurried, I need you to tell everyone here the real reason you left this marriage. Belinda blinked. Glenda made a sharp sound in her throat. Richard forced a laugh. You're being dramatic. It's a child's birthday party. Yes, it is, I agreed. And you're welcome to stay and celebrate Noah, but the rule stands. You're embarrassing yourself, Glenda said, with that cool contempt she had always used on me, the kind designed to make a woman feel small and grateful for the correction. It had worked for years. It did not work anymore. I don't feel embarrassed, Glenda, I said politely. Thank you for your concern. Carla had gone very still near the kitchen doorway. Percy watched with the careful look of a man who knows when to wait. Richard stepped toward me and lowered his voice. This is not the time or the place. You chose the time and the place, I reminded him. You called me and said the party would be here, the gifts opened here. I simply have one rule before we begin. This is insane, Belinda said quietly, mostly to herself. I looked at her without unkindness. I'm sorry you're uncomfortable. That's not my intention. My intention is the truth. Richard switched approaches. He softened his voice, spread his hands. Vivian, this is Noah's day. Let's enjoy it. I agree completely, I said. But my rule still stands. No one sits until the truth comes out. Carla stepped forward from the doorway then. Her voice was quiet but firm. Mom, she said, what proof do you have? I smiled at my daughter. Then I walked to the side table and picked up the folder. I opened the folder without rushing. I had thought through this moment carefully, not to be cruel or to perform, but because I knew that if I was going to do this, every word needed to land clearly, without anger blurring the edges. I placed the first set of papers on the coffee table so they faced the room. These are bank records, I said simply. This is an account at Meridian Savings that Richard opened in the second year of our marriage. The mailing address on the account was Glenda's house. I paused and glanced up briefly. Not mine. Not ours, hers. Glenda's face went very still, the kind of stillness that tells you everything. During our divorce proceedings, I continued, Richard filed financial disclosures showing limited assets and difficulty meeting support obligations. He asked the court to reduce what he owed me. The court agreed. I turned a page. What Richard did not disclose was that this account existed. At the time of our divorce filing, it held $94,260. The number sat in the room like something dropped on a hard floor. Belinda looked at her husband. Richard's jaw was tight. He said nothing. I didn't know about this account at the time, I said. I found out 2 years ago when Percy noticed something unusual in old joint tax records. I looked at Percy, who gave one steady nod. We spent months piecing together the full picture. This is ancient history, Richard said finally. His voice was strained and low. I can and I am, I told him. Glenda moved toward the table. Percy stepped quietly to one side in a way that stopped her without any confrontation. I was not angry. What I felt was something much cleaner than anger. Like a door opening after years of pushing against it. There is more, I said. I pulled out a single printed page. 2 years ago, I said, I was going through an old phone before switching providers. I found a voicemail Richard had left me, about 14 months after the divorce was finalized. I looked at Richard steadily. I believe you had been drinking. His face had gone pale. I pressed play on the recording I had transferred and preserved across several devices, making certain it was never lost. Richard's voice filled my living room. Unmistakable, loose at the edges, the way voices become when the careful walls people build come down without warning. He talked about the money. He talked about being afraid I would take everything. He mentioned that Glenda had told him to protect himself before the divorce was even official. He mentioned Belinda. He admitted things had been going on with her much longer than he had ever said in court. When the recording ended, the silence was absolute. Noah had been quietly moved by Carla into the kitchen. I had seen her do it smoothly, without fuss, the way good mothers handle things. He was not in the room for any of this. That had always been my firmest line. Belinda's wide smile had gone entirely. She was looking at her husband with an expression I recognized. The look of a woman realizing that the version of events she was given may not have been the full version. "You told me it was completely over before you asked me out," she said. Her voice was very quiet. Richard said nothing. Glenda tried to recover. "This is all taken out of context. You cannot seriously expect anyone here to." "No one is leaving with those gifts," I said then, looking at the pile on the table. "They were purchased with money that is legally, in part, mine. My attorney is already aware." Richard looked at me, and for the first time in 6 years I saw something in his eyes that looked like real fear. Not performance, not calculation. Fear. It was Noah who broke the silence next. He had crept back to the kitchen doorway, because that is what curious 8-year-olds do. He stood there in his birthday shirt, the silver rocket on the front, looking at his grandfather with eyes too serious for a child on his birthday. "Grandpa," he said softly, "did you make Gran cry?" The question was simple and direct, and it landed harder than anything I could have said. Richard turned to look at his grandson and seemed to forget the documents and the recording and the watching room. He just stood there like a man asked something he had no answer for. "Noah, buddy," he started. "Mom cries when she talks about when she was little," Noah continued, not accusing, just working things out in the open way children do. "She says some things just hurt, and that's okay. Did you hurt Gran?" Carla appeared and gently placed her hands on Noah's shoulders. "Let's get cake started, sweet pea," she said softly. She guided him back to the kitchen and glanced over her shoulder at her father with a look I think Richard will carry a very long time. Not rage. Disappointment goes deeper than rage, and stays longer. Glenda seized the moment. "This has gone far enough. You are ruining a child's birthday." "Glenda," I said calmly, "you helped him hide the account. The mailing address was yours." She opened her mouth and closed it again. Percy said quietly, "We have statements going back 9 years. Deposits, the mailing address, signature cards, all of it." Glenda looked at her son. Richard looked at the floor. "I gave you every chance to sit down and be honest," I told Richard. "You chose not to. Now everyone knows what I know." I walked to the side table and picked up a sealed envelope. From my attorney, Ruth Abernathy. A motion to reopen the divorce settlement based on fraud. You have 30 days to respond. Richard took it with hands that were not quite steady. Guests left quietly. Richard's distant cousin Anita hugged me at the door and pressed my hand and said nothing, which said everything. A neighbor couple who had known me for 20 years shook their heads slightly as they passed Richard on the way out. Glenda left without speaking to me. A relief. Belinda lingered near the door like she wanted to say something. But she walked out after her husband, and I thought about the particular loneliness of learning that the story you were told about yourself was not the full one. Richard made one last attempt at the door. "You didn't have to do it like this," he said. "You didn't have to hide $94,000, I said. "And yet." He glanced at the gifts on the table. "Those belong to Noah. Noah will have his party, a real one. The gifts will be here when that happens. But they are not leaving this house today, Richard. Not until this is settled." He stared at me a long moment. Then he walked out. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway, the one I had repainted sage green the summer after the divorce, and breathed. In and out. Steady. Then I went to the kitchen, where Carla sat at the table with Noah in front of a small piece of chocolate cake, studying it solemnly. "Is the party canceled?" he asked. I sat across from him and smiled. Postponed, I said. But I promise you, the best real party is coming next weekend, just the people who belong here. He thought about this carefully. Then he picked up his fork. Okay, he said. Can I have more cake? You can have all the cake you want, I told him, and for the first time in a very long time, I laughed without any weight behind it. My phone rang before I finished my first cup of coffee the next morning. Richard. I let it go to voicemail. He called again, 10 minutes later. On the third call, I picked up. I had finished my coffee, and I was ready. He had been crying. I could hear it in the particular roughness of his voice, the kind that comes from a night of it, more about being caught than genuine remorse, but real nonetheless. Vivian, he said, I want to work this out. I'll pay everything, every dollar. Just drop the case with Ruth. No, I said. Think about what this does to the family. Richard, I said, you thought about what this would do to the family when you hid money in your mother's mailing address for 3 years. You thought about it and did it anyway. You don't get to use the family as a shield now. He was quiet. Then, I'm sorry. I considered whether I believed him. I thought about the 31 years of nursing shifts, coming home tired and still making dinner and helping with homework and being the person who held everything together while Richard built his career. I thought about that first winter after the divorce, turning the heating down, believing every word he had said about having nothing left. I hear you, I told him honestly, but an apology doesn't reopen that account. My attorney is moving forward. I hung up. Ruth Abernathy had been my attorney for 14 months. She was in her late 50s, precise and unhurried, with the quality of making everything she said sound not only true but inevitable. When I had first brought her the evidence, she had gone through it slowly and looked up over her reading glasses. This is fraud, she had said simply. Clean and well documented. We have a very strong case. The motion had been filed. The process was moving. All I had to do was hold steady while it did, which, after 6 years of rebuilding myself quietly, was something I had become genuinely good at. Glenda showed up at my door on a Wednesday, 2 days after the birthday party that never happened. She brought yellow carnations wrapped in grocery store cellophane and wore her sorrowful face, the one she brought out when she wanted something. I had seen it many times over the years, usually right before she said something that was going to cost me. Come in, I said. She sat at my kitchen table, set down the flowers, and folded her hands. She talked about family, about forgiveness, about how what Richard had done came from fear, and fear was just weakness, and weakness deserved understanding. I listened. I made her tea because that is how I was raised, and I let her keep talking. What she did not know was that I had pressed record on my phone when I answered the door. Ruth had told me early on that, in our state, one-party consent recording is perfectly legal. I simply needed to be part of the conversation. I was very much part of it. Glenda talked for a long time, and because she wanted me to drop the case, because she believed I was still the tired, heartbroken woman she remembered from 6 years ago, she said the thing that sealed everything. She said that she and Richard had known the money would be a problem during the divorce proceedings, so they had put it in her name to keep it safe. She said they had planned to return it to Richard gradually in small amounts that would not attract notice. She said this to my face, with the carnations on the table between us. That evening I sent the recording to Ruth. She called back within the hour. Vivian, she said, and I could hear the quiet satisfaction beneath her measured tone. She just admitted on tape to participating in marital asset fraud. I looked out my kitchen window at the flower beds I had planted the summer after the divorce, full and green and exactly what I had always wanted them to be. Good, I said. Ruth filed the motion to reopen the divorce settlement on a Thursday morning. I know the exact day because I had been waiting for it the way you wait for a storm to break. Not with dread, but with the tired relief of knowing the clouds are finally moving. It's filed, she told me. The other side has been served. Expect noise. The noise came quickly. Richard hired a new attorney named Frank Okafor, who had a reputation for being aggressive. Frank sent a letter to Ruth arguing that I was acting out of vindictiveness and that the so-called new evidence was circumstantial and improperly obtained. Ruth read it to me over the phone and then said, simply, that she was not impressed. She filed our response within 48 hours, attaching the bank records, the voicemail transcript, the recording of Glenda's visit, and a sworn statement from Percy detailing exactly how he had uncovered the account and what the tax records showed. Everything was clean, dated, and documented. The judge assigned to the case was the Honorable Sandra Birch. Ruth knew of her by reputation. She does not appreciate being misled, Ruth told me. And she does not appreciate people who hide things from her court. 3 weeks after filing, Judge Birch ordered a full forensic audit of all Richard's financial accounts, going back 10 years. Frank Okafor objected. The judge overruled him. I sat in my living room that evening and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not triumph exactly, but something quieter. The feeling of having stood in the place where the truth was and refused to move, and watching the world begin to turn toward it. Carla came by with sparkling cider and 2 glasses. She did not say much. We sat on the porch in the fading evening light, and the neighborhood settled around us, and that was enough. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said. "I'm proud of us," I told her. The audit took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of ordinary life, grocery shopping, tending the flower beds, volunteering Tuesday mornings at the library's reading program, while somewhere a team of forensic accountants went through a decade of Richard's financial history with the kind of careful attention he had never expected anyone to give it. Ruth kept me informed in measured updates, calling weekly. She was not the kind of attorney who traded in drama. She told me what was confirmed, what was still being verified, and what came next. What I did not expect was the call from Percy on a Tuesday evening, 5 weeks into the audit. "Vivian," he said, "I found something I missed the first time. There's a second account." I set down my book. "What do you mean?" "Smaller, about 18,000, but it's under a company name. A numbered company Richard set up shortly before the divorce. No real business activity, just a shell to hold money." I sat with this for a moment. "Does Ruth know?" "Sending her everything tonight," Percy said. Ruth called me the next morning. "This changes our damages total, considerably." When the audit report came back at the end of the 6 weeks, it confirmed both accounts. It confirmed the transfers, the deliberate restructuring of Richard's visible finances to make him appear to have fewer assets than he did. The hidden total came to over $112,000. The auditors flagged it as intentional concealment. I sat with Ruth in her office on the day she showed me the final report and read each page slowly. When I finished, I looked up. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Ruth said, setting down her pen, "we go to court." I nodded and gathered my bag and drove home through the late afternoon, thinking about nothing much and everything at once, the way you do when something large is finally almost over. I want to tell you about the moment I stopped being afraid. It happened in the courthouse parking lot, 20 minutes before the hearing. I was sitting in my car in my good gray coat, the one I wore to important things, looking at the entrance to the building, and I noticed that my hands in my lap were completely still. For the first years after the divorce, I used to shake sometimes, not dramatically, the kind of shaking others cannot see, small and internal, a physical echo of all the uncertainty I was carrying. I would shake when I had to deal with anything connected to Richard. Legal letters, phone calls, even running into someone who knew us both. I was not shaking now. The hearing that day was evidentiary, both sides presenting their core arguments to Judge Birch before she determined whether to void the original settlement and recalculate the division of assets. Richard was already there with Frank Okafor when I arrived. He looked older than I remembered, older even than at Noah's birthday, just 10 weeks before. His suit was new but sat on him strangely, like something bought to project confidence that was not quite convincing. Ruth presented our case in the measured, unhurried way she did everything. She walked the judge through the Meridian Savings account, the shell company, the tax disclosures, the voicemail, and Glenda's recorded admission. Each piece was submitted as a clean, clearly labeled exhibit. Frank Okafor objected several times. Judge Birch overruled him each time without apparent annoyance, simply moving forward. At the end of the hearing, Judge Birch looked at Richard over her reading glasses. "Mr. Calloway," she said, Did you disclose all marital assets as required by law during your divorce proceeding? Richard looked at Frank. Frank gave a small, almost invisible shake of his head. Richard said nothing. Judge Birch wrote something on her notepad. We'll reconvene in 3 weeks for the ruling, she said. She closed her folder. I walked out into the light and breathed the cold air and felt entirely calm. The 3 weeks before the ruling were the strangest of the whole experience. Everything had been said that needed saying. Every document was filed, every piece of evidence entered into the record. There was nothing left to do but wait, and waiting after so much motion felt deeply strange, like the silence after a long piece of music. I kept busy in the ways I knew best. I worked in the flower beds even though the growing season was mostly done, turning the soil, breaking up the packed earth, getting it ready for what would come later. There's something grounding about gardening when your life is in the middle of something large. The soil does not care about your court case. It simply needs turning. I spent time with Noah. Carla brought him over twice that month. We did puzzles at the kitchen table and made homemade pizza one evening with toppings of his choosing, which included far too much cheese and, experimentally, some gummy bears. I said yes. Some things you just say yes to. Richard tried twice to reach me outside of official channels. First a text saying he was willing to settle privately before the ruling. I forwarded it to Ruth. Second, an unannounced visit on a rainy evening. He knocked. I opened the door but did not invite him in. He stood in the porch light looking reduced, smaller than I had ever seen him, like someone who had been holding himself up for years through sheer effort and no longer had the energy for it. Vivian, he said, please. Whatever you want to say it through Ruth, I told him. He stood there a moment longer. Then he nodded and went back to his car. I closed the door and stood in my hallway, in the sage green hallway that was entirely mine, and breathed carefully until the quiet settled back around me. 3 days later, Ruth called. The ruling came in, she said. My heart beat one slow, solid beat. And? We won, Ruth said simply. Everything. The ruling was detailed and unambiguous. Judge Birch found that Richard had deliberately concealed marital assets during the original divorce proceeding, constituting fraud upon the court. The original settlement was voided. A new division of assets was ordered based on the actual total, both the Meridian Savings Account and the Shell Company funds. I was awarded the full $112,000 in hidden assets, plus interest calculated from the date of the original settlement. I was also awarded my legal fees in full, on the grounds that the fraud had forced litigation that should never have been necessary. Richard was ordered to pay everything within 90 days. Frank Okafor filed an appeal within 48 hours, the kind that gets filed to buy time, not because it has real merit. Ruth reviewed it and told me so plainly. 6 weeks later, the appeals court denied it, in a ruling that took less than 2 pages to explain its reasoning. During this period, I heard through Carla, who heard through a cousin who still knew people, who knew Richard and Belinda, that things at home were not going well. Belinda had moved into the guest room after the birthday party. She had questions Richard either could not or would not answer satisfactorily. I did not feel satisfaction about this. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something more careful. A recognition that people who build lives on hidden things tend to find those hidden things surfacing at the worst possible moments. I had not caused Belinda's unhappiness. Richard had, years before she or I understood the full shape of it. What I focused on was the number. $112,000, plus interest, plus legal fees. Glenda's vacation cabin, a small property 3 hours north that she had talked about at family gatherings for years, had to be sold to help Richard meet part of what he owed, since Ruth had demonstrated that Glenda had benefited from the concealed assets and admitted her participation on tape. And I intended to collect every cent the court had ordered. 2 weeks before the payment deadline, Carla called. Dad's in the hospital, she said, her voice careful and measured, stating a fact, not asking anything of me. His heart. A warning episode. He's stable. I thanked her and hung up. Over the next 2 days, I received 3 calls from relatives asking if I would consider giving Richard more time or reducing the amount, given the circumstances. His cousin Martin called. An old family friend named Barbara called. Even Richard's younger sister Trish, who I had always genuinely liked, called and gently asked me to consider the full picture. I listened to each of them with patience and without anger. I told them I understood their concern. I told them I wished Richard a full recovery. Then I called Ruth and asked her to prepare the payment enforcement documents for when the deadline arrived. "You don't want to extend it?" Ruth asked. "No," I said. "Good," she said. "A health episode, while unfortunate, does not legally alter a court order." On the morning of deadline -1 week, I drove to the hospital, not out of pity, and not to be cruel. I want to be precise about my intention because it matters. I went because I had something to deliver. Richard was sitting up in the hospital bed, looking washed out and tired, a monitor beeping softly at his side. Belinda was not there. I set the manila envelope with the court's payment documentation on the table beside his water cup. "This is your formal payment notice," I said. "I came in person because I thought it deserved that." He looked at the envelope, then at me. "I don't hate you, Richard," I said honestly, "but I also don't owe you my financial future. I never did." I left quietly and drove home through the pale morning light, feeling neither hard nor soft, just clear. Richard made the first payment installment 4 days before the deadline. It was not the full amount at once. He had negotiated with Ruth for a court-approved structured payment plan, since liquidating everything immediately would have required selling assets under severe pressure. The plan called for payments over 18 months, the first being the largest. The payment cleared Ruth's trust account on a Tuesday afternoon. She called to confirm. I was replanting a section of my flower bed when she called, and I sat back on my heels in the cool dirt and listened to the number and felt something shift quietly in my chest. That money represented years. It represented the winters I had turned the heating down, the savings I had rebuilt from nearly nothing. It represented 31 years of partnership that Richard had chosen to reduce to a transaction and cheat. And now the court had looked at all of it and said, no. And here was the evidence of that, in a dollar amount that was finally actually mine. To meet the payment schedule, Richard sold his truck, a large, expensive thing he had been proud of, and refinanced his house. Glenda's vacation cabin had already sold. I had heard this from Percy through professional channels. She had bragged about that cabin at family gatherings for years. Now it was gone, along with her ability to claim she had simply been helping her son. Actions have consequences, and in this case, the consequences were accurate. Noah's real birthday party happened on a Saturday in early October. I decorated the yard with string lights. There was cake and a space-themed scavenger hunt, and 12 of his friends running across my lawn in the golden afternoon light. Richard was not there. Nobody mentioned him. Noah hugged me at the end of the evening and said it was the best party ever. I believed him completely. Belinda left Richard in November. Carla mentioned it carefully, watching my face as she said it, to see how I was receiving the news. I kept my expression calm and simply nodded. "Are you okay?" Carla asked. "I'm fine," I said, and I meant it entirely. Belinda leaving was not a victory. I want to say that clearly because I know how it might sound. That woman had built her life around a version of Richard that turned out to be carefully constructed, and the unraveling of it was not something I had wished on her. I hoped she found her footing. I hoped whatever came next for her was honest. What Richard did after Belinda left was knock on my door one Thursday evening in late November. He stood in the porch light, in a jacket too light for the weather, looking at me with the expression of a man who has run out of strategies and is now simply himself. Which is a strange, vulnerable thing to see in someone you once loved and then spent years being hurt by. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped back and held the door open. He came into my living room with its new paint and rearranged furniture and photographs from which his face had been entirely absent for years, and sat while I stayed standing. He talked. He said things he should have said long before. He said he had been afraid. He said his mother had shaped his ideas about money in ways he had never thought to question. He said he was sorry in a way that finally sounded more real than rehearsed. When he finished, I said, "I accept your apology, Richard. That's for me, not for you. It means I'm done carrying that weight." But we are not friends. We are Noah's grandparents. That's what we'll be. He nodded, thanked me for listening, left. I closed the door and stood in my hallway and felt exactly as settled as I had hoped I would. I have always believed that money is not an end in itself. When the first payment cleared, I sat with a notepad and thought carefully about what to do with it. My savings had been slowly rebuilt in the years since the divorce. What I received from the settlement was something above that. Years returned to me. Years of what I should have had. I wanted to use it in a way that reflected exactly that. The first thing I did was renovate the house. Not drastically. The bones were good, and I had always loved them. But in all the ways I had wanted to and kept putting off. I had the kitchen updated, with the countertops I had admired for years in a magazine I kept by my chair. I had the upstairs bathroom retiled in soft white with blue details that made it feel like being near water. I had the back porch enclosed so I could sit out there year-round with my books and my coffee. Every choice was mine. Every color, every fixture. There was something quietly extraordinary about that. Moving through a space where every decision had been made by me. For me, without the slow erosion of yourself that happens in a long marriage when you are the one who always eventually gives in. The second thing I did was open a college fund for Noah and for Carla's younger daughter Iris, who was 4 and already showed the same watchful intelligence her mother had at that age. I set aside enough that both of them would have a real foundation. Not a complete free ride, because I believe in young people having skin in the game, but enough that money would not be the loudest voice in the room when they were deciding what to do with their lives. The third thing I did was refinish the floors throughout the house with a warm honey-colored stain I had wanted for years. Richard used to say polished floors were impractical. He was wrong about that too. Glenda called me from a hospital in January. A different hospital, in a different city. She had been admitted for something with her lungs, a chronic condition that had been worsening. She called my number directly. We had not spoken since she stood in my living room and told me I was embarrassing myself. I answered. Her voice on the phone was smaller than I had ever heard it. Illness strips the usual architecture away and leaves just the person underneath. She asked if I would come see her. I said I would think about it. I did think about it. For 2 days, I thought about all the years Glenda had undermined me. The small comments, the loaded silences, the way she angled Richard away from me when things were hard instead of toward me. I thought about the carnations she had brought to my house to manipulate me into dropping the case. I thought about the tape. Then I went anyway. Not because I owed her anything. Not because forgiveness works in my life the way it does in movies, clean and easily arrived at. But because I am 64 years old, and I have watched enough people leave this world to know that the things we do not say tend to follow us in ways we do not want. She was propped up in the hospital bed looking diminished, the way hospital beds make everyone look, without her usual careful presentation. Just an old woman who had made choices and could now see their full weight. She said she had never liked me. She said she had always encouraged Richard to leave. She said she was sorry. I sat with her for an hour. When I left, I said, I forgive you, Glenda. That's for me. I hope you feel better. I meant both things. I drove home through the gray January afternoon, feeling lighter than I had in years. The final payment arrived in April. 18 months after the court's ruling, the last installment cleared Ruth's trust account, and she called on a Tuesday morning. I was on my back porch with coffee. The birds were doing something cheerful in the bushes at the edge of the yard. That's everything, Ruth said. In full, as ordered. Thank you, Ruth, for everything. It was a good case, she said simply. Clear evidence, a client who did not lose her nerve. Those are the things that win. After we hung up, I sat for a while without doing much. The coffee cooled. The birds continued. Somewhere down the street a lawnmower started up, which seemed right. It was the time of year when everything begins again. I thought about the woman I had been 14 months earlier, standing in my living room with a folder and a phone and 6 years of quiet preparation, facing a room full of people who expected me to fold. I had not folded. I had not shouted or threatened or broken anything. I had simply held the truth in my hands and let it do what truth does when given enough room. Richard had filed one final appeal during the previous winter, a last attempt to reduce the interest and fees. It was denied in a ruling Ruth described as almost curt. The judge had very little patience for it. The system is not perfect. There are women who fight for years and do not reach the ending I reached. I had advantages: a son-in-law with a sharp eye, an attorney who believed in the case, enough stability to pursue it. I do not take any of that for granted. But I also worked for it. I kept every document. I saved every recording. I held steady when people told me to let go. On that Tuesday in April, with birds in the bushes and cooling coffee in my hands, it was finally completely done. I started volunteering at the women's shelter in May. It had been on my mind since the previous fall, when I mentioned it almost offhandedly to Ruth, and she looked at me with something warm in her expression and said, "You should. You'd be good at it." The shelter was called Turning Point. It occupied a converted building on the north side of the city, with a warm front office and a community room where women and their children sometimes stayed for weeks while they figured out what came next. The work was practical and unglamorous, helping women navigate paperwork, connecting them with resources, sitting with someone who had just left a situation that had taken years to recognize for what it was. I went in on Wednesday mornings and Friday afternoons. Sometimes the work was administrative. Sometimes it was sitting with a woman in the community room and listening, which has always been something I can do well. I did not tell my story to everyone. That was not why I was there. But sometimes, when it was right, when a woman sat across from me looking at a folder of financial documents, as though understanding them was beyond her, I would share a piece of it. I would tell her I was a retired nurse who had been married 30 years and divorced 6 years ago, and who had discovered at 62 that her ex-husband had hidden over $100,000 from her during their divorce. That I had been 63 when I filed the motion to reopen the settlement. 64 when I won. I would watch the expression across from me shift, from something closed and heavy to something slightly more open. Not hope yet, but the first movement toward it. The recognition that these things can be fought, that you do not have to be young or loud or connected to stand in the place where the truth is. That is what I had to give. That and a willingness to sit and listen for as long as it took. I found it was more than enough. Richard sent the final check with a note. It was handwritten on plain paper, not a card. It said, "Vivian, I know I'm late understanding this. I'm sorry for what I took. I hope you're well." It was not much. For 31 years of marriage and 6 years of what came after, it was not much at all. But it was honest, probably the most honest thing he had written to me in years. I read it twice, folded it, and put it in the small drawer where I keep things I want to remember are finished. The drawer holds an old birthday card from Noah, a note from Carla, a letter my mother wrote me when I graduated nursing school decades ago. I put Richard's note in there with those things, not because it belonged in the same category, but because it was done. It could rest. I deposited the check that afternoon, stood at the teller's window and watched the number appear on the transaction slip, and felt the clean, quiet completeness of it. On the drive home, I stopped at the garden center because I had been meaning to pick up seeds for the spring planting. A new variety of lavender for the back fence and a climbing rose I had been considering for the side trellis. The woman at the garden center was my age, with soil under her nails and cheerful opinions about everything. We talked about companion planting for 20 minutes while I collected what I needed. I drove home with seeds in a paper bag on the passenger seat and the windows partway down because it was one of those spring days that makes being alive feel particularly worth doing. The kind of day that smells like something starting. I pulled into my driveway in front of my house, with my flower beds and my enclosed porch and my honey-colored floors, and I sat in the car for just a moment with the April light on my face. Then I got out, took the seeds inside, and started planting the garden. Percy and Carla threw a small dinner party in June. They set the table with their good dishes and a tablecloth Carla had been given by Percy's grandmother and invited 6 people. Me, Carla's close friend Adazy, Percy's colleague Bernard and his wife June, and a new neighbor named Constance, who had moved in next door to them the previous autumn and turned out to be wonderful company. It was the kind of dinner that goes on longer than planned, because nobody really wants it to end. The food was good, and the conversation moved easily between serious things and funny things, the way it does when people are comfortable with each other. Noah ate at the kitchen table with a coloring book, and came in occasionally to show us his work, and each time the whole table gave it proper attention, because he deserved that, and he knew it. At some point in the evening, Constance asked what I had been up to lately. I told her about the shelter volunteering. I told her about the garden. I mentioned the house renovation briefly, not wanting to spend a dinner party talking about my own countertops. She asked if I missed nursing. I thought about it honestly. I miss the feeling of helping someone through something hard, I said. I think that's why I ended up at the shelter. Constance nodded. That makes complete sense, she said. And then we talked about something else, and the evening continued its easy movement through the hours. Driving home through streets I had driven for 30 years. Streets that looked different to me now, lit from inside rather than just illuminated from outside, if that makes sense. I thought about what I would tell a younger version of myself if I could. I would tell her, something very hard is coming, and it is going to take longer than feels survivable. But you are going to come out of it with your name on the house, and your flowers in the garden, and your honest friends around your table. I would tell her, hold on to the documents, hold on to the truth. Do not fold. Today, I am sitting on my back porch. It is a Saturday morning in late summer. The light comes through the screen at an angle that turns everything gold. My coffee is hot. The lavender along the back fence is doing exactly what the garden center promised, growing generously, smelling extraordinary. The climbing rose has taken hold on the side trellis and is reaching upward exactly as I hoped. Noah is coming this afternoon with Carla, Percy, and little Iris, who is 5 and full of loud opinions about everything, which I find completely delightful. I have made the chocolate cake from my grandmother's recipe, the only one Noah accepts for important occasions. A scavenger hunt is planned. I have cleared enough room in the living room for the kind of running around that happens when you put 2 children in a house that loves them. I think about Richard sometimes. Not with anger. That burned out long ago, replaced by something quieter I can only call clarity. He was not a monster. He was a man who let fear and greed in his mother's voice lead him into dishonesty. Those choices cost him more than he planned on. I think about the woman I was 6 years ago in the same house with the lights turned down to save money, telling myself I was managing fine. I would tell her, you are more patient than you know, more prepared than you feel. Do not let anyone make you believe your silence is the only option. I never raised my voice, I never broke a law, I never did anything I would not do again in exactly the same way. I simply stood in the room and held the truth in my hands and waited for the world to catch up to it. And here's where I am. In my home, in my garden, in my life, all of which are completely mine. If your ex ever walks back in and tries to take over like he never left, remember, you are allowed to set the rules. You are allowed to require the truth before anyone sits down. The quietest rule you set can become the loudest thing in the room, and sometimes the woman they thought they could walk over ends up standing taller than ever.